All right, so today we're going to be talking about the beginning of the American Revolution. Yes, you should be taking notes on this. This is our new unit on the American Revolution, and our next test will include information from this lecture. And remember, on all tests, you can use notes. So, here we are, the American Revolution. In September of 1774, we had a group of colonial leaders get together and hold what is known now as the First Continental Congress. It was 56 men delegates. They came to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and they were here to create some ideas that would help the Americans in their arguments with Great Britain. Now, we know that Great Britain had just come off of creating the intolerable acts, the coercive acts. And those were the acts that we talked about that happened right after the Boston Tea Party, where Great Britain was punishing the Americans for participating in the Boston Tea Party. And so they did things like Parliament closed down the Boston Harbor. They ordered the people to quarter troops. They had all of these acts that they were trying to control the American people. Now, the American people were upset with this. And so these delegates get together. Now, all of the colonies, all the 13 colonies were represented except Georgia, because at this time, Georgia was fighting a Native American uprising. They were fighting against the Native Americans, and they needed the British. They needed the British for military supplies. They needed the British for arms, ammunition, all of that. They could not afford to become independent because they relied on the British for these things. Also, Georgia was made up of convicts and outlaws. And so at this time, the other colonies really didn't want to include Georgia in the whole idea of statehood. So these leaders get together, and it includes some of the most prominent men of the time. We have people like George Washington, who had done some great things in the French and Indian War. We have Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, John Adams. John Adams later becomes a president. John Jay, who is the leader of our Supreme Court later. These are all very, very important people getting together to discuss what they're going to do with Great Britain. Now, the colonies were very independent at this time. They were not really united. They all believed that they were Virginians or Pennsylvanians or New Yorkers. But this Continental Congress showed them that they needed to work together. They needed to become more united. And this quote from Patrick Henry definitely defines that. The distinctions between Virginians and Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers and New Englands are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American. Now, this quote was important because they now were starting to see themselves as part of a large group of people with a common concern, not just someone that was an individual that represented a colony. And it really shows the beginning of the first time we feel that we have a national identity. We're coming together as a nation. And this was important because in order to fight against a country as large as Great Britain, as strong as Great Britain, the colonies really needed to show a united front. They needed to become one. So, what they did at this First Continental Congress was they got together to discuss how much they felt the coercive acts were hurting Americans. They got together and they talked about wanting to boycott trade, fighting for their rights, and they were going to send this petition to King George. So the first thing they did is they drafted a statement of grievances. The grievances were things that they felt were unfair and that they were violating the colonial rights. And so they called for a repeal of the coercive acts. They no longer wanted to have the Boston port closed. They didn't want to have to quarter soldiers. Any of those intolerable acts were violating their rights as citizens. So they called to repeal them, to take them away. The next thing they also did is they wanted to boycott all British goods and trade. Now, this meant that no British products could be brought into or consumed in the colonies, and no colonial goods could be shipped to Britain. This was important because it was really hitting Britain where it hurt monetarily. They were definitely reliant on the colonial trade. They were reliant on the goods. And so many people in the Continental Congress felt that if they boycotted British goods and trade, then what would happen is they would have a quick victory without war because the king and parliament would back down because they relied on the trade. And so they felt like they could have the coercive acts repealed, they could have their rights restored without a fight if they boycotted. And then, most importantly, they also began to form a militia. This gives us a clue that maybe they didn't believe we could get away without fighting, because what a militia is a militia is a group of citizen soldiers. These are not trained military people. These are not people whose job it is to fight in an army or a navy. These are farmers and citizens, townspeople who use their own weapons to band together and fight. And a militia shows that the colonists are starting to gear up for a possible war. So, on one hand, you have people believing that the boycott is going to end without bloodshed. They're going to be able to boycott goods, but no one is going to have to fight. And then you have another group of people who say, well, we need to be prepared. So they form this militia. Now, these people in the colonies are starting to gather arms. They're starting to gather ammunition, and they're trained as the well-known Minutemen. Now, Minutemen were militia companies. They had training sessions. They made their own bullets. They stockpiled weapons, rifles, and muskets. And they called themselves Minutemen because they felt like they could be prepared to fight on a minute's notice. They didn't have to wait around like an army. They would hear that they needed to fight, they would drop what they were doing, their regular job, and they would go and fight. So they began to build this militia, this group of Minutemen. And they're not the only ones. The British are also preparing for conflict. King George III announces to Parliament at this time that the colonies are in a state of rebellion. And he sends word to his British general, Sir Thomas Gage, to arrest some of the more outspoken members of the revolution. So Sam Adams, John Hancock are in Lexington, and British General Gage gets this order to arrest them. And he has about 3,000 soldiers under his command in New England, in the Boston area. And so he also gets instructions to take the gunpowder that was hidden in a nearby town called Concord and then head into Lexington to get Sam Adams and John Hancock. And so they learned that the militia, the American militia, was storing arms and ammunition in Concord. It's about 20 miles north of Boston. And so he sends about 700 troops to Concord to seize that artillery. Now, the Patriots, the Americans, are watching the British troops, and they see this movement and they start to warn the nearby towns. One of the ways they warn the nearby towns is on April 18th of 1775, a gentleman by the name of Paul Revere and William Dawes go on horseback and they gallop across the countryside and warn the villages that the British are starting to move. They're starting to advance upon Lexington and Concord, and people need to be prepared. When Revere finally gets to Lexington, he tells Samuel Adams and John Hancock the news that the British are preparing, they're mobilizing, they're on their way. And Sam Adams is excited about this. He's ready to fight. He goes so far as to say, what a glorious morning this is. And He's ready to fight for American independence. Not everybody is as excited. So the next morning at dawn on April 19th, about 700 British troops arrive in Lexington. When they get there, they see about 77 militiamen, the Minutemen. Now, this is hugely outnumbered, 700 versus 77. A British major yells at the militiamen, the Minutemen, to throw down your arms, ye villains, ye rebels. And the militiamen have been ordered to disperse when the shots rang out. They've been ordered that if someone starts to shoot, they're supposed to disband, they're supposed to leave. Now, we don't know to this day what happened, but shots were fired. Several shots were fired. When everything happened, at the end, when everything happened, we had about 8 Americans killed and 9 wounded. And John Adams and Hancock were not found by the British, so they had been able to escape. But to this day, we don't know who fired first. The British major says that the militiamen, the Minutemen, fired first, where the Minutemen said, of course, that the British fired first. But when it was all said and done, 8 Americans killed, 9 wounded, and the British troops continued on their way to Concord to go get the weapons. So after Lexington, the British decide to move on to Concord because their true goal is to get the alleged gunpowder that is hidden in Concord. And so they head off to Concord, but by this time, most of the people in Concord had had plenty of warning that the British were on their way. And so they were able to take that gunpowder and they were able to remove it, relocate it, hide it. The gunpowder was gone. There were a few things that the British found when they moved into Concord. They found a few cannons, some artillery, and they decided to burn what little they found. While they were burning it, the fire got out of hand. Now, there were hundreds of militiamen, American colonist revolutionaries, occupying the high ground outside of Concord. When they saw them burning the artillery, they mistakenly thought that the British were burning down the city of the town of Concord. And so they decided to defend. And they headed off to Concord's Bridge, which the British had to cross in order to leave, and began to defend it. Now, the British fired first during this particular battle, but fell back when the colonists were fighting back. And this was the first big time that the colonists had fought back. In Lexington, the colonists, the militiamen, were ordered to disperse. And so they had relatively few casualties because they were greatly outnumbered. But now we had hundreds and hundreds, thousands of militiamen descending upon the city because all of the neighboring villages were gathering their militia. So the British searched Concord for about 4 hours, and as they were preparing to return to Boston, about 2,000 militiamen joined, and they descended upon the area. They started to fight. The militia was, remember, they're not trained soldiers, and so they're citizens. These are blacksmiths and farmers and saddle makers and clerks. And what they're doing is they're hiding behind trees, they're hiding behind fences, they're hiding behind stone walls and houses, and they're shooting at the British as the British are walking down this road. What happened then is the British started to drop some extra weapons, equipment, so that they could retreat faster because they were just getting shot at as they were walking down the road. When they finally got into Lexington, they found that there were even more militia coming. They had gotten some new redcoats, some new British soldiers to help them out. But for the most part, they were getting Minutemen from all around. They had Salem, Massachusetts, Marblehead, Massachusetts, and the militiamen were planning on finishing off. The British were able to finally get out, where they finally had some naval support. And they were able to get down the road and kind of escape. They were able to retreat. Well, by the time they finally reached Boston, they had wounded about 250 of the redcoats. There were about 3,500 militiamen firing constantly for 18 miles. And on the American side, there were about 90 people killed, which was relatively low compared to the 250 British soldiers that were killed or wounded. Um, and it was a victory for the Americans. Now, the Americans were not trained. It was a militia made up of citizens. They were over whelmed at first. They had way more British soldiers than American militia. They were able to stand up to and fight against one of the greatest military powers in the world. And it really proved to them that they could stand up and they could have a chance to win this battle. Now, many of the colonists were not really ready for independence, but they realized that now that they were going to have to fight for independence. Looking back on this battle, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the poet Ralph Waldo Emerson um, dubbed this as the shot heard round the world. And it's important to note that this was that first battle for independence that the Americans fought against Great Britain, and it made a huge impact. So it showed the Americans that they actually had a chance of winning. So this is the beginning of our American Revolution.